They did not call it Africa. Long before the world gave it a name, the land already had a pulse, a heartbeat that echoed through kingdoms, empires, deserts, rainforests, and savannas. The sound of drums wasn't just music, it was history, memory, identity. There was no dark continent. There was only a continent blazing with life. Africa was not waiting to be discovered. Africa was already living, thriving, and ruling. Before Europe even realized what lay beyond the horizon, Africa was home to some of the world's most advanced civilizations. Empires with irrigation systems, taxation structures, universities, libraries, legal codes, military formations, trade networks, and philosophical schools of thought. While much of medieval Europe struggled with famine, war, and disease, great African cities were glowing with scholarship and commerce. In West Africa, the smell of leather, gold, and salt drifted through the air as caravans stretched across the Sahara. Mile after mile of merchants, scholars, soldiers, and storytellers. In North Africa, stone cities and golden sand harmonized in a world where mathematics, astronomy, and written law flourished. In South Africa, stone fortresses rose from the earth, engineered with precision. And along the East African coast, the ocean carried voices speaking Swahili, Arabic, Persian, and Chinese. Africa was a world connected. But history books did not start the story here. They began in the middle, at the moment of invasion. To understand colonialism, we must first understand what existed before it. Not a void, not a blank map, not savages waiting to be saved, but civilizations that had already written their own stories. In ancient Ghana, gold was so abundant that dogs were said to wear collars of pure gold. The empire didn't mine it recklessly. It controlled its extraction with remarkable precision. Gold went north through trade routes. Ideas came south through scholars and traders. Empires were not built on luck. They were built on systems. Farther east, the Empire of Mali emerged. Mansa Musa, one of its greatest rulers, would be remembered as the richest man in recorded human history. His wealth was not folklore, it was documented. When Mansa Musa traveled to Mecca in 1324, he carried so much gold that the value of gold in Cairo crashed for over a decade due to inflation. He built mosques, sponsored education, and attracted scholars from around the known world. In his time, the city of Timbuktu became a beacon of knowledge. Its libraries held over 700,000 manuscripts, law texts, scientific papers, medical documents. Education was free. Students came from Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe. Meanwhile, in the east, the Swahili coast shimmered with trade cities: Kilwa, Mombasa, Zanzibar. Ships from Arabia and China anchored at its ports. Africa wasn't isolated, it was plugged into the world economy. Kilwa's architecture was so refined that Portuguese explorers later admitted that its stone palaces and multi-storied buildings rivaled anything in Europe. Southwards, in the grasslands of Zimbabwe, rose an engineering masterpiece, Great Zimbabwe. A fortress of granite walls, some towering over 30 feet, built entirely without mortar. Every stone was shaped, measured, and fitted perfectly. The structure still stands, defying the racist myth that Africans were incapable of building in stone. Africa knew mathematics. Africa knew architecture. Africa knew governance. This was the Africa Europe did not want the world to know. But for centuries, outsiders peered across the sea, seeing gold, ivory, land, and bodies, not civilizations. Europe noticed Africa long before it arrived. First came curiosity, then came envy, then came hunger. At first, trade was mutual. African kingdoms negotiated with European ships the way equal nations negotiate today. Europeans waited on the coasts, respecting boundaries because they had no power inside the continent. They paid tribute, offered gifts, and followed African laws. But something changed. European kings and merchants didn't just want gold and spices, they wanted power. A brutal new idea was quietly growing in European political circles. Why trade with Africa when we can own Africa? To achieve that, Europe needed superior military technology, maps, navigation tools, and one more thing: a belief strong enough to justify mass theft and violence. Religion became the shield. Race became the sword. Europe constructed a lie that Africans were inferior, uncivilized, and needed saving. This narrative was not accidental. It was strategy. Because to enslave a people, you must first convince the world that they are not fully human. And so the propaganda began. European writers described Africa as a land of chaos and backwardness. They ignored Timbuktu's libraries, ignored the universities of Fez and Cairo, ignored the architecture of Great Zimbabwe. They erased thousands of years of African contributions to science, medicine, agriculture, engineering, and philosophy. The narrative worked. Soon, European ships stopped coming as traders. They came as hunters. The transatlantic slave trade began. Europe's demand for labor exploded as sugar plantations expanded in the Caribbean and the Americas. African men, women, and children were torn from their families, shackled, branded, and packed into ships like cargo. Millions died before even reaching the ships. Millions more died at sea. Those who survived were sold, families erased, languages silenced, cultures fragmented. For Europe, the slave trade became an economic miracle. For Africa, it became a demographic catastrophe. The continent lost more than people. It lost knowledge, innovation, continuity, and stability. When colonies in the Americas later gained independence, Europe needed a new source of wealth, one that could replace the lost labor force and continue the flow of riches. Their eyes returned to Africa. By the 19th century, European nations were industrializing. Factories needed raw materials, rubber, palm oil, cotton, minerals. Africa had them in abundance. Europe also needed new markets where it could dump manufactured goods. Africa became the target of a new phase, not slavery, but territorial conquest. European explorers, backed by governments, bankers, and weapons manufacturers, mapped rivers, documented mineral deposits, and sent secret reports to their rulers. They traveled under the guise of discovery, science, or religion. But their journals told a different truth. They were surveying land for ownership. Soon, missionaries followed. With Bibles in hand, they preached new faith, new values, new identities. The pattern became clear. First came the missionaries, then came the merchants, then came the soldiers. Africans welcomed missionaries with hospitality, but Europe was not coming to save souls. It was coming to claim territory. The continent was about to be carved like a cake. In 1884, European leaders gathered in Berlin. Not a single African was invited. They spread a blank map on the table and drew borders, straight lines, ruler sharp, cutting through ethnic groups, kingdoms, and civilizations. The Berlin Conference was not a meeting. It was a robbery. Africa was divided like merchandise. Entire nations were swallowed overnight. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries vanished in signature strokes. European soldiers and administrators flooded the continent. They demanded land, they demanded taxes, they demanded labor. Africans resisted. They fought with spears against rifles, strategies against gunboats, courage against machines.
Some battles were lost, others won, but Europe had one advantage: industrial warfare. Soon, flags replaced kingdoms, borders replaced identities. Colonial rule tightened its grip. Laws were rewritten, languages imposed, cultures criminalized. Land was stolen and handed to European settlers. Africans were forced into mines, plantations, railways, and domestic servitude. A continent that once traded freely with the world became a prisoner of exploitation. And while Europe extracted wealth from African soil, it also extracted memory, rewriting history to portray itself as the benevolent liberator, the civilizer. But history remembers differently. Africa did not fall because it was weak. Africa fell because Europe discovered new weapons, new ideologies, and new excuses. Yet even as colonialism tightened its grip, resistance simmered. Warriors rose, prophets rose, revolutionaries rose. The scramble for Africa had begun as a negotiation in Europe, but on the ground in Africa, it unfolded as a war. A war not always declared openly, but fought through treaties, lies, manipulation, and force. European powers moved quickly. What they could not secure through diplomacy, they took with violence. Soldiers marched into villages demanding allegiance to a flag that had never been seen before. Chiefs were forced to sign treaties written in languages they did not understand. Many were told these documents promised friendship and military protection. In reality, they were signing away sovereignty. One treaty signed under deception was between King Lobengula of the Ndebele and British colonial agents. The chiefs thought they were granting limited mining rights. Instead, the document claimed full administrative control of their land. When Lobengula protested, British newspapers accused him of savagery and used the headline as justification for invasion. Across Africa, similar scenes played out. Paper was used first, bullets followed next. European powers had different approaches, but their goals were the same: control, profit, dominance. Britain adopted indirect rule. France preferred assimilation. Belgium relied on terror. Germany imposed militarized rule. Britain's tactic was to govern through local chiefs, allowing colonial rule to hide behind familiar faces. Chiefs who resisted were replaced with compliant ones, those who agreed to collect taxes and enforce labor. It created divisions that would later explode into political conflict long after independence. France had a different mission: to make Africans French, not by invitation, but by force. They imposed the French language and French education, attempting to erase local cultures and replace them with French identity. Africans were taught that their traditions were primitive, their religions backward, and their languages irrelevant. Colonialism didn't just take land, it attacked identity. Still, Africa resisted. Resistance took many forms: armed rebellion, diplomacy, sabotage, spiritual defiance, cultural preservation. Each region fought differently, but they fought. In West Africa, the Asante Empire resisted British invasion with remarkable discipline. Queen Mother Ya Asantewa rallied the warriors, declaring that if the men were afraid, she would lead the fight herself. Her courage turned her into a legend. In Sudan, the Mahdist forces defeated the British in the Battle of Khartoum, proving that colonial armies were not invincible. In Ethiopia, Emperor Menelik II united his people to defeat Italy in the Battle of Adwa. Rifles roared, drums thundered, and Ethiopia crushed the European army on African soil. The victory sent shockwaves across the world. For the first time, colonized people everywhere saw proof that a European empire could be defeated. Ethiopia became a symbol of African pride. There were also resistances without swords. In Nigeria, traditional priests urged communities not to pay colonial taxes. In Kenya, women smuggled food to fighters hiding in forests. In the Congo, workers sabotaged machinery in protest of quotas. Colonial administrators labeled every act of resistance as rebellion, even when Africans were defending ancestral land. The rhetoric was always the same: the natives of Ireland, we are restoring order. Violence used by colonizers was called civilization. Violence used by Africans was called savagery. Colonial administrators didn't just rely on guns. They used divide and rule. They drew borders that split ethnic groups and forced unrelated communities together. They favored certain groups over others, creating hierarchy that would fuel ethnic conflict later. Colonizers wrote tribal identities into law, turning flexible social groups into rigid political labels. Nothing was accidental. Every decision served a purpose. Minerals went to Europe. Cash crops replaced food crops. Africans farmed for Europe but went hungry on their own land. Railways that many today admire were not built to connect African communities. They were engineered to extract resources, from mines to ports, from plantations to ships. If a railway line did not lead to a port, it did not exist. Africans were forced to work through systems like forced labor, conscription, and unpaid taxes. Workers lived in compounds under armed supervision. Disease, starvation, and exhaustion killed thousands. Colonialism was not development, it was extraction. Yet, even under oppression, African societies adapted. They held on to language, preserved names, maintained storytelling traditions. Secret schools taught banned subjects. Underground political movements began forming, inspired by global ideas like nationalism, socialism, and Pan-Africanism. A new generation emerged. Africans who could read the laws of the colonizer and use those same laws against colonization.
These young Africans studied in colonial schools but refused colonial thinking. They traveled to America, to Europe, and returned with ideas of resistance. They read about liberation struggles in Asia and Latin America. They saw that colonial empires were not eternal. African consciousness woke like a storm. Resistance was no longer just tribal or regional. It began to take a new form, a united continental struggle for independence.
Across the continent, a new wind began to blow, invisible, yet undeniable.
It started as whispers in classrooms, debates in student halls, midnight gatherings in back rooms, fiery articles in newspapers that colonial administrators tried to shut down. It lived in the minds of young Africans who were taught the language of the colonizer, but not the mentality of submission. The seeds of resistance had now become ideas. Ideas are dangerous to empires. Europe had conquered land, but now it faced something far more resilient, a generation that refused to remain subjects. These young Africans began to see that colonialism did not just steal resources, it stole dignity. They realized the purpose of colonial education had been to produce clerks, interpreters, and loyal subordinates who would manage the colony on behalf of imperial rule. But instead, it produced thinkers, lawyers, journalists, historians, and revolutionaries. The same books that preached European superiority also included stories of ancient democracies, revolutions, independence struggles, and human rights. Knowledge became a weapon. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah returned from his studies abroad convinced that political freedom was the foundation of all progress. He spoke passionately about a united Africa, not divided by borders Europeans had drawn in Berlin, but united by a shared destiny. His message ignited a fire. He declared, "Seek ye first the political kingdom," meaning, freedom comes first, development will follow. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere used Swahili to unite people across hundreds of ethnic groups, proving that language could be a bridge, not a barrier. He rejected tribal divisions and preached collective identity. Africans were not tribes loyal to colonial rulers. They were citizens of nations. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta studied anthropology in London and used his understanding of culture to articulate why land was not just property, it was identity, history, memory. In Senegal, Léopold Sédar Senghor infused poetry into politics, arguing that African identity was not inferior, it was distinct, valuable, and complete. Revolutionaries emerged from unexpected places. Patrice Lumumba was once just a postal clerk. Thomas Sankara was a military officer with a guitar and a charismatic fire. Amilcar Cabral wasn't a soldier. He was an agronomist who believed that people who understand farming understand revolution, because both require patience, timing, and strategy. These men and women were not fighting to rule. They were fighting to restore what had been taken. Pan-Africanism became the heartbeat of the struggle. The belief that Africa must stand united, not as 54 divided fragments created by colonial cartography, but as a single force capable of determining its destiny. The colonial powers began to worry. For the first time, Africans were not only resisting with weapons, they were resisting with ideas, unity, political organization, and economic sabotage. Colonial governments responded with surveillance, censorship, arrests, and intimidation. The British dug trenches around political meetings. The French banned African newspapers. The Portuguese imprisoned freedom thinkers in island fortresses. But ideas cannot be jailed. The world itself was changing. After World War II, Europe lay in ruins. Cities bombed, economies shattered, and millions dead. The same powers that once boasted of dominance were now dependent on foreign aid. The United States and the Soviet Union rose as global rivals, both preaching anti-colonial rhetoric to win influence with newly liberated nations.
Suddenly, it became politically embarrassing to rule colonies. But Europe was not ready to let go willingly. Instead, new strategies were developed to delay independence and keep economic control. Constitutions were rewritten with complicated conditions. Ethnic groups were pitted against each other. Elections were rigged. Loyal puppet leaders were cultivated to take power. Men who would protect European mining interests, oil concessions, and trade agreements. Yet, resistance movements did not stop. They intensified. In North Africa, Algeria erupted in flames. French settlers considered Algeria a literal extension of France, not a colony, but piece of the homeland. So when Algerians demanded independence, France responded with torture, assassinations, mass arrests, and concentration camps. The war lasted 8 years. Hundreds of thousands died. Algerians refused to stop. Across the continent, in Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising grew from a whisper into a forest fire. Africans who had been pushed off their land by British settlers demanded their land back. The colonial government responded with detention camps, executions, and forced relocations. But the Mau Mau fighters had something Britain did not: memory of the land that raised them. They knew every path, every cliff, every forest trail. They fought not for ideology, but for the soil that held their ancestors. Britain eventually defeated the Mau Mau militarily, but lost the political war. The uprising broke the psychological foundation of British control. In Egypt, Gamal Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, seizing it from Britain and France. The move shocked Europe, a former colony, in open defiance, claiming economic ownership of its resources. It was unthinkable. Nasser won. The message was clear: African countries did not need permission. Resistance spread like wildfire. Freedom was no longer a question of if, but when. Colonial administrators felt the heat. They started offering gradual independence, hoping to control the transition. They packed away flags, but kept control of banks, companies, mines, shipping lines, and trade routes. They negotiated economic agreements that ensured former colonies would borrow money from the same powers that once extracted wealth from them. Political independence was on the horizon, but economic dependence was already being engineered. Still, the people celebrated. Across Africa, crowds filled the streets. Drums thundered, flags rose, tears flowed. For the first time in centuries, Africans watched the flags of Europe come down and their own rise in their place. But independence was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Many African leaders had inherited nations divided, not by culture or history, but by borders that cut across ethnic groups, resources, and allegiances. Colonialism had created countries without nations, governments without unity, economies without self-sufficiency. Some leaders had grand dreams of unity. Kwame Nkrumah believed that Africa could only defeat neocolonialism if it remained one. He argued, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of the African continent." He called for a United States of Africa. But Europe and the West feared a strong, united Africa. A united Africa could control its own resources. A united Africa could negotiate trade from a position of strength. A united Africa could challenge Western dominance. Some African leaders were influenced. Others were bribed. Secret wars were funded, coups were engineered, false rumors were planted. Where unity was possible, division was manufactured. The cost of independence was high. In Congo, Patrice Lumumba became the first democratically elected leader. He spoke boldly, refusing to bow to foreign powers. He believed Congo's minerals should benefit Congolese people, not Western corporations. Within months, newspapers smeared him. His political opponents were armed. Belgian forces interfered. The CIA joined the plot.
Patrice Lumumba was arrested, beaten, executed, and dissolved in acid. The message was clear. Africa could be free, but not too powerful. In Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara changed the name of his country from Upper Volta to Land of Upright People. He redistributed land, rejected foreign loans, planted millions of trees to fight desertification, and promoted women's rights. He declared, "He who feeds you controls you." Western powers hated him for that sentence. Sankara was assassinated during a coup backed by foreign interests. These assassinations were not isolated events. They were part of a systematic plan. Every leader who pushed for complete economic independence became a target. Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau, Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique, Samora Machel in Mozambique, all killed or destabilized. But even in death, their ideas stayed alive. New nations began forming schools, universities, parliament buildings, roads were built, railways expanded, hospitals opened. Children studied subjects once banned under colonial rule. African history, African philosophy, African literature. A people denied their identity were now reclaiming it. They revived languages, restored traditions, renamed streets, and replaced colonial statues. History was no longer written by invaders. It was written by those who had endured. Yet beneath the celebration, a new battle awaited, the battle against neo-colonialism. Political freedom had been achieved, but economic freedom remained distant. Former colonial powers returned with loans, multinational corporations, development aid, and diplomatic influence. Colonialism had changed its clothing, but not its intentions. Europe no longer ruled through armies. It ruled through contracts, debts, and corporations. However, a new generation was watching, a generation that saw the past clearly and the future even more clearly. They understood that Africa's story had not ended with independence. It was still being written. The continent has survived capture, slavery, colonialism, and attempted erasure. It had resisted for centuries against some of the most powerful empires in the world. And now, Africa stood once again at the doorway of destiny. Aware of its history, conscious of its identity, determined to define its future. The struggle for liberation was about to evolve into something deeper. The struggle for true sovereignty. The winds of change blowing across Africa in the early 20th century carried a quiet but unstoppable power: knowledge. Western education, originally introduced by missionaries to produce clerks and interpreters who would serve colonial bureaucracy, became the very tool that awakened African resistance. In mission schools scattered across the continent, young Africans learned how to read, write, debate, analyze policies, and understand political systems. The colonial governments thought they were creating efficient workers. Instead, they unintentionally created thinkers, agitators, and future liberators. Students like Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Nnamdi Ezekwe in Nigeria began asking questions colonial officials feared.
Why must an African bow to a foreign power on his own land? For the first time, Africans could express resistance not only through warfare, but through words, newspapers, unions, strikes, petitions, and political movements. Education created nationalism, but nationalism needed fuel. That fuel came, ironically, from World War I and World War II. Both wars dragged thousands of Africans, willingly or by force, into European battlefields. Africans fought in muddy trenches in Europe, deserts in North Africa, jungles in Burma. They saw death closely. They heard European soldiers talk about freedom, democracy, and self-determination. They asked themselves, why are Europeans fighting for freedoms they denied to Africa? African veterans returned home changed forever. They came back not as subjects, but as men who believed they earned the right to demand equality. They understood that Europeans were not invincible. They had seen them bleed. They had seen them defeated. They had seen them afraid. And they began to organize. In the 1930s and 1940s, a new intellectual wave emerged from Africa and the African diaspora, the Pan-African movement. It linked Africans, African Americans, and Afro-Caribbeans with a single message: Africa must unite. Pan-Africanism became the ideological backbone of African nationalism. Writers, lawyers, journalists, and activists used newspapers to attack colonialism. African newspapers were banned, writers were arrested, yet the fire of resistance only grew. Then, in 1945, something happened that changed everything. The Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England. Africans demanded full independence, not reforms, not gradual change, but total liberation. Kwame Nkrumah stood up and said, "We are prepared to fight, if need be, for our inalienable right to freedom." Those words traveled across oceans and deserts, echoing into villages and crowded cities. Africa was waking up. But colonial powers did not sit back quietly. They used new tactics to crush independence movements. In British territories, they introduced indirect rule, governing through traditional chiefs. In French colonies, they followed a policy of assimilation, insisting that Africans could become black Frenchmen if they adopted French culture. Both strategies failed. African identities were too deep to erase. Meanwhile, Africans became more defiant. Workers formed trade unions and went on strike, refusing to continue carrying colonial economies on their backs. Women's movements grew, demanding political inclusion and economic rights. Farmers refused unfair taxation and confiscation of land. Large-scale rebellions erupted across the continent. In West Africa, cocoa farmers in Ghana boycotted colonial merchants who cheated them with unfair pricing. In Nigeria, women led powerful protests against colonial taxation, the Aba Women's War of 1929, one of the largest gender-driven anti-colonial movements in African history. In North Africa, freedom took a more military turn. Algerians had fought alongside France in World War II, believing their sacrifice would earn them respect. Instead, when they marched peacefully for rights in 1945, French troops opened fire and massacred thousands. The Algerian reaction was absolute. If France will not grant freedom, we will take it by force. What followed was one of the bloodiest anti-colonial wars, the Algerian War of Independence, a war that shook Europe. But the most dramatic confrontation was happening in Kenya. The British had stolen fertile land from the Kikuyu people and given it to settlers. Africans who lived on that land for centuries became squatters, laborers on their own ancestral soil. Resistance turned into underground organization. Oath-taking ceremonies grew, uniting fighters under one slogan: land and freedom. The British called them terrorists. Africans called them heroes. The world knows them today as Mau Mau fighters. The British responded with brutal force, detention camps, executions, torture. But the movement planted something far more powerful than fear.
It planted the idea that freedom was worth dying for. By the late 1950s, Europe faced a reality it could no longer ignore. Africans were no longer begging for independence. They were demanding it. They were fighting for it, and they were ready to die for it. Whispers of rebellion turned into shouts of defiance. Shouts became rallies. Rallies grew into political parties. The colonial world was crumbling. From the Gold Coast to Nigeria, Kenya to Algeria, Congo to Angola, Africa was no longer bowing. The first major victory came from a place many Europeans underestimated: the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah mobilized a mass movement unlike anything Africa had ever seen. Millions of ordinary citizens, workers, farmers, students joined hands with one vision: self-government now. British authorities imprisoned Nkrumah, thinking it would stop the movement. Instead, protests intensified. Nkrumah ran for office from prison and won. On March 6, 1957, Ghana became the first black African nation to gain independence. Nkrumah stood before a roaring crowd and declared, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent." His words ignited a fuse. What started as isolated rebellions had become a continental revolution. Europe realized that Africa was no longer asking, "When will you give us independence?" Africa was declaring, "Whether you are ready or not, independence has come."
Independence swept across Africa like a whirlwind, but colonialism was not finished, not yet. Europe still held on tightly to regions where valuable resources and white settler power were concentrated. These places became the final battlegrounds of African liberation. The continent had reached a turning point. Freedom had begun, but the fight was not over. In the southern region of Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, then known as Rhodesia, Namibia, and South Africa, the struggle was harder, bloodier, more intense than anywhere else. Portugal, unlike Britain or France, made its intentions brutally clear. Africa would never get independence. Portugal believed African colonies existed solely for the economic prosperity of the Portuguese. Angola and Mozambique were treated not as territories, but as extensions of Portugal itself. Forced labor, military conscription, and economic exploitation became the foundation of Portuguese colonial rule. But people do not remain silent forever. In Angola, a liberation movement, the MPLA, began fighting a long and painful guerrilla war. In Mozambique, Frelimo did the same. Ordinary Africans, some armed with nothing more than hunting rifles and captured weapons, fought professional European armies. Mothers hid fighters in their homes. Farmers smuggled food and weapons through forests. Priests used churches to transport messages. The struggle was not only military, it was emotional. Africans were no longer fighting simply to remove foreign flags. They were fighting to reclaim their dignity, their identity, their humanity. And something unexpected happened. The world began to listen. The United Nations condemned colonial rule. Cuba and the Soviet Union offered help to independence movements. Western citizens marched in cities carrying banners that read, "Freedom for Africa." The final blow to Portuguese power came in 1974 when the Portuguese military, exhausted by endless war, overthrew its own government. Within months, Angola and Mozambique were granted independence. Angola, 1975. Mozambique, 1975. Africa was changing. But the story was more complicated in Zimbabwe, then known as Rhodesia. White settlers there declared themselves the rightful rulers of the land. They refused majority rule. They declared independence without British approval, trying to maintain white domination indefinitely. Africans were pushed off fertile land and forced into barren reserves. But resistance formed. Guerrilla fighters crossed borders into Zambia and Mozambique, receiving training and weapons. The Bush War in Rhodesia lasted over a decade. Thousands died. Victory came in 1980. Zimbabwe became independent. Robert Mugabe stood on a stage in Harare as the Rhodesian flag was lowered. The crowd watched with tears in their eyes. For the first time in centuries, Zimbabweans could say, "This land is ours." But the hardest fight of all, the symbol of global racism and segregation, was still unfolding in South Africa. Apartheid was not just a political system. It was a methodical attempt to break the African mind, spirit, and identity. Black South Africans were forced to live in segregated areas. They needed permits to enter cities. They were not allowed to vote, own land in many regions, or attend good schools. Apartheid was a prison without walls. When Africans protested peacefully in 1960 during the Sharpeville demonstration, police opened fire and massacred 69 unarmed civilians. The world watched in shock, but even horror could not silence the voices of resistance. Nelson Mandela, a young lawyer and activist, stood before a court and declared, "I am prepared to die." He was imprisoned for 27 years. He became a global symbol of hope. While Mandela was behind bars, students took over the struggle. In 1976, students in Soweto protested against being forced to learn in Afrikaans, the language of their oppressors. Police opened fire, and one photograph changed the world. The body of 12-year-old Hector Peterson being carried by a crying teenager. That image broke millions of hearts. South Africa could jail leaders, but it could not jail an entire generation. International pressure mounted. Sanctions crushed the economy. Global movements called for divestment. The world turned its back on apartheid. Inside the country, resistance movements united. Black, white, Asian, colored, human beings joined together and demanded freedom. Finally, in 1990, Mandela walked out of prison. 4 years later, in 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election. For the first time in history, black South Africans cast their votes as free people. Mandela became president. A new Africa had emerged. The last colonial system had fallen. But the end of colonial rule did not erase the scars it left behind. Africa inherited artificial borders that forced rival ethnic groups into the same state. Economies dependent on exporting raw materials instead of producing finished goods. Governments structured like colonial administrations, prioritizing power over people. Europe had drawn borders during the Berlin Conference with straight rulers and zero understanding of cultural realities. Entire nations like Nigeria, Kenya, Sudan were created by outsiders. Ethnic tensions caused by these artificial borders led to wars and conflicts long after independence. Colonialism also planted something deeper and more dangerous, an identity crisis. Africans were told for decades that their languages were inferior, their religions primitive, their culture backward. Schools taught European history, European literature, European achievements, but ignored African heroes, African kingdoms, African knowledge systems. Many Africans grew up knowing the kings of England, but not the emperors of Mali or the queens of Nubia. The psychological damage was immense, but healing began with truth. Africa slowly reclaimed its history, rewriting its story through its own lens, not the lens of the colonizer. Universities introduced African studies. Writers and filmmakers and musicians told stories of resistance and pride. Colonialism had tried to erase African identity. Instead, it inspired a renaissance. Today, Africa is rising, not because it is returning to its past, but because it is embracing it. A new generation of Africans is redefining success, power, and identity. Startups compete globally. Nations reform educational systems. Musicians dominate international charts. The continent that was once divided at a European conference is now united by something Europe could not destroy: resilience, creativity, pride, hope. Africa is not a story of colonization. Africa is a story of survival, resistance, and rebirth. A continent that once nourished the world is now reclaiming its place within it. The world once asked, "Who will save Africa?" Now Africa answers, "We were never powerless. We were only interrupted."
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel for more untold history like this. See you next.